you today. We're spending a few months taking a wide-angle view of the Scriptures. I think a lot of us know the Bible stories, but we've never really thought about how they fit together. So there's a big picture, and it extends from creation to new creation. We don't see how that works. We have a jumble of stories in our minds from the Bible. Like we know about Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've heard the story of Judah and Tamar, David and Bathsheba, we know that one. Solomon, everybody knows him. Some of us know about Hezekiah or Zerubbabel. And of course, we know about Jesus. We know the stories, but we don't see what ties them together. They're tied together by a line that runs through them. We saw that line last week. We saw that it began with an ancient Mesopotamian named Abraham. And that line runs through the Bible until it comes to a point, the point that God was making through all of it, the point of it all, Jesus. He is God's answer to the fall. He is creation's only hope. He is humanity's glorious future. Today we're going to look at Genesis 22. And what that means is, in this series taking a long-angle view, I am skipping over one of the high points in the panorama, the covenant that God made with Abraham. I'm skipping it intentionally because a few months ago I preached on that passage, which is Genesis 15. So I would encourage you to go to our website and watch that sermon again. It will be dated October 5th. Although I know some of you remember every word that I said, and so you don't have to do that. But for a few of you others, go to the website and look at it. I'm going to refresh your memory anyways, just in case you don't have it all down pat. In Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham, promising to give him descendants. Now, he didn't make that vow just because he liked Abraham. That vow was all about fulfilling the promise to bless all the peoples of the earth. God's plan, as we saw last week, was to reverse the consequences of the fall, undo the curse that fell with Adam, and heal humanity. The plan began with Abraham, but it leads to Jesus. It's not God's plan A, it's God's plan only. But there was a problem. Isn't there always a problem in our lives and in the Scriptures? When God established the covenant, Abraham and Isaac were childless. But God's plan required descendants. Now, Sarah had longed for a baby, but couldn't conceive. And she had given up hope for a child a long time ago. I don't think we can imagine Abraham and Sarah's joy when they learned that she was pregnant. They named the baby Isaac, which means laughter. And that ought to tell us something. Isaac was their pride and joy. I can imagine you could catch Abraham just sitting and watching his boy when he was 2 and when he was 10 and when he was 20, and with a smile on his face. But I think there were times when he looked and he could see a line stretching into the future, reaching to that promise of global blessing through this child. And now we come to chapter 22, where God's plan only, which was entirely dependent on a boy named Laughter, was put at risk. And it was God who put it there. So our passage, Genesis 22, opens with a problematic statement. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. The King James Version says, God tempted Abraham, which is how that verb is often translated. Why would God tempt his covenant partner? Or did he test him? Or is there any difference between the two? I think there is. The difference between a test and a temptation lies in its origin and in its motive. If it originates with Satan, it is a temptation. If it originates with God, it's a test. St. James said, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. The other difference between a temptation and a test has to do with motive. A temptation is an enticement to do evil, but God never wants us to do evil. Satan does. However, God does test us for the purpose of bringing good to us or to others. So Moses tells the Israelites that God tested you so that in the end it might go well with you. God cares so much about that end, about how you end, that he's willing to employ hardship in the present. Once we understand the difference, God tests, the devil tempts, that still doesn't clear up the difficulty. Why should God need to test? Doesn't he who sees the end from the beginning know how we're going to fare in the test? And if he already knows, why put us through it? I'm going to give you 3 possible reasons. 1, God doesn't need to know, but we do. Though God knew what Abraham would do, Abraham did not. And it was important for Abraham to know what he would do, to have his loyalty confirmed. Whether we succeed in a test or fail, it's important for us to know where we stand. That is always to our benefit, to know where we stand, even when we wish we were standing somewhere else. 2, the Bible tells us that others are watching how we go through these tests. For example, unbelievers are watching. St. Peter says that during trials, they see us live such lives among them, the pagans, that they see our good deeds and glorify God. Unbelievers are watching. Believers are watching. Paul says that the Christians who watched him go through his trial, his imprisonment, were encouraged to speak the word of God boldly. When we go through tests and do it well, it helps our families, our friends, our church. 3, I shouldn't say 3. Let me mention one other thing about those who are watching. Paul claims that our lives are proof to other, more august beings of God's wisdom, to rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm. You'll remember that Job's great test was played out before a heavenly audience. St. Peter speaks of angels that long to look into things dealing with our salvation. 3rd thing, tests not only reveal what's in us, they change what's in us. And we need that change. God is working in us an eternal weight of glory, not despite, but through our trials. Our troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. In Genesis 22, we see God doing something in Abraham's life that Abraham needs. And perhaps angels and rulers and authorities were watching it happen. He said to Abraham, this is verse 1, Abraham. And Abraham answered the way a slave answers his master. Here I am. I like that. Here I am. Millions of people want God to say to them, here I am. Maybe it's because they crave excitement or maybe they need assurance, but they want God to say, here I am, but never think of saying that to God. But if you want God to be available to you, you'd better be available to him. So the next time that you think God may be speaking to you, it could happen this morning. try saying, "Here I am." And then pay attention to what comes next. Verse 2, take your son. Lord, I have two sons. Ishmael, he's living down in Paran with his mother right now. And Isaac, your only son. My only son? Isaac. Oh, Isaac, my laughter, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. That's not a bad idea. A trip with Isaac, sort of father-son bonding time. I've heard the wild goat hunting down there is fantastic. So we've never done that before. That'll be great. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. On one of the mountains I will show you. If I awoke to a vision in the middle of the night, and in that vision God said to me, take your son whom you love and sacrifice him as a burnt offering, I wouldn't do it. I'd figure that I put too much hot sauce on my burrito at supper. I would not think for a moment God was asking me to kill my own son. God isn't like that. Didn't Abraham know that? I think the answer to that question is no, he didn't. Think about it. Abraham did not have a Bible. He did not have a Moses or the prophets. He didn't have nearly 4,000 years of Judeo-Christian teaching. The law that forbade human sacrifice would not even be enacted for another 400 years. Abraham came from a land where human sacrifice was not unheard of. He came to a land where child sacrifice was practiced, not just at this time, but for the next 1,000 years. It would have made sense to Abraham that Yahweh God, like Moloch or Baal, might demand absolute proof of allegiance. Abraham wouldn't like it, but he would not have the moral objections against it that we have. What would have seemed incomprehensible to Abraham was God's call to sacrifice the son of the promise, the heir of the covenant. God's promises to Abraham, promises about land, promises about heirs, could only be fulfilled if Isaac had children of his own. To plunge the sacrificial knife into Isaac would cut the line that ran to the promise. It would not only silence Abraham's laughter, it would nullify God's covenant. If there was ever a time to hesitate, it was now. And yet, early the next morning, Abraham sets out for Moriah. He understood the necessity of prompt obedience. I think if he would have delayed at this point, he would never have obeyed. So early next morning, this is verse 3, he saddled his donkey, took Isaac and 2 servants, cut the wood, because he didn't know if he's going to be in a place where he would find wood. If you've ever been in the Middle East, you'll know. You'll understand that. And he set out. Now, Moriah was located in what would later be called Jerusalem. It's about 45 miles northeast as the crow flies from where Abraham was living. And now comes the question, why Moriah? What's special about that place? Couldn't he just do it in Beersheba where he lived? Why make him walk for 3 days to think about the unthinkable and maybe change his mind? Abraham, as far as we know, didn't ask any of those questions. He just went. He obeyed. Verse 5 now. When they were within sight of the mountain where the sacrifice was going to take place, Abraham said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and we'll come back to you. Did you catch that? We will come back to you. Was Abraham delusional? He was about to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. And yet he says, we'll come back. But this wasn't a delusion. Hebrews tells us that Abraham reasoned So that's what he's doing on this 3-day walk. He reasoned that God would bring Isaac back from the dead if that's what it took. God would not renege on his promise. Abraham knew that. Abraham could pass the test because he learned how to do something that you and I must learn. He learned how to reason by faith. Now, look at the next lines. The next lines are just filled with emotion. Isaac spoke up, "Father?" "Yes, my son." "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" How would you have answered that question? What could you say? Look at how Abraham answered. His next words are really important, prophetic even. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Now, this is one of those stories that everybody knows. Abraham binds his son, something he could not have done had Isaac resisted. For Isaac was a young, strong man by this time, and Abraham was not. Then Abraham laid him on the pyre, raised the sacrificial blade, was about to bring it down when, verse 11, "Abraham, Abraham." This is one of only a handful of times that God ever repeats somebody's name. "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God." So Abraham untied Isaac, and as he was doing so, he heard a noise in a nearby thicket. There was a ram there caught by its horns. So a ready sacrifice provided by the Lord. So verse 14, Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it's said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So on the mountain of the Lord, not in the valley of self-indulgence. It's on the mountain of the Lord that our needs are provided. It's the obedient, not the disobedient, who experience God as provider. I have met a few people over the years who have complained to me that God did not come through for them when they needed him. But they hadn't even begun the journey to the mountain of the Lord. You know where the mountain of the Lord is? It is the place where you sacrifice anything that is more important to you than the Lord. That's where we find God to be our provider. Now, back in chapter 15, which I'm skipping, but you all remember perfectly the sermon, we ran across this line. Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. That is an important line, and we're going to see it again as we go through this series. God doesn't count you righteous because you're religious, or because you're nice, or because you do good things for people. He counts you righteous because you believe in him. Not with some kind of philosophical, churchy belief, but in a relational, personal way like Abraham did. You trust him, and God counts that as righteousness. But there's another side to this coin, and it's found in verses 16 and 17 of our chapter 22. "Because you have done this, I will surely bless you." See, righteousness comes through faith, faith alone. Blessing comes through obedience. Abraham's life was characterized by both. And really, they are inseparable. Faith generates obedience. Obedience strengthens faith. Some people see a conflict there. They see a conflict between faith and being able to reason well. That is artificial. The believer and the rationalist, they may oppose each other, but faith and reason, they are old friends. The author of Hebrews tells us that armed with God's promises, Abraham reasoned by faith. He invented the discipline of faith reasoning. That's a discipline that you need to become proficient at if you're going to pass your tests. Now, I'm going to take this wide-angle lens that we've been using and zoom out to see how this story connects with the rest of the picture. Abraham was told to sacrifice his only son. And Abraham and Isaac went on God's specific instruction to the land of Moriah. They looked up, verse 4, and in the distance they saw the place where the offering was to be made. And Isaac carried the wood, verse 6, on his back on which he would be sacrificed. The word Moriah appears only twice in the whole Bible. One other time besides this, that's in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. In that verse, we learn that God appeared to David in this very spot in Moriah, 1,000 years after Abraham. The Lord ordered David to build an altar here. He was to offer a sacrifice to turn aside the judgment that was devastating Israel. I don't think there's a coincidence in this. And it was here, the place where David built that altar, that his son Solomon was directed to build the temple on this hill that was so far from where Abraham lived. Tens of thousands of rams and lambs and bullocks would be offered in sacrifice over a period of centuries. Blood would run like rivers on Moriah. But Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. And a second, smaller temple was built by a later generation that returned after the exile. 500 years after that return, Herod the Great enlarged the second temple. You know, in a way, that's not quite true. Herod the Great promised to, what would the word be, remodel the temple. What he ended up doing was tearing it down so that he could build a much larger temple. But I suspect that it was not quite built on the same site, the site of the original temple. That might not be true. This is my suspicion. But to date, no archaeological evidence of the first temple has ever been found on that site, the site of Herod's temple. So here's the question. Why did God send Abraham on a 3-day journey to build an altar and offer his son on a particular hill in Moriah? Why did God 1,000 years later order David to build an altar there and offer a sacrifice to turn aside judgment? Why did David instruct Solomon to build the Lord's temple, and more specifically, to build the altar of the Lord's temple on that spot? I think the reason has to do with a man who would, 2,000 years after Abram, trudge up this very hill carrying the wood upon which he would be offered. I think it was on this spot, a millennium after David turned aside the judgment, that God, Romans 3:25, presented him, Jesus, as a propitiation. You know what a propitiation is? A sacrifice that turns aside judgment. After rivers of blood had flowed from this spot during the first temple and the second temple, the blood that seals the eternal covenant flowed from one man's hands and side. See, God, who moves through time like we move through rooms in a house, could see this all and see it all simultaneously. In this place, he sees Abraham offering Isaac, David presenting a burnt offering, Solomon offering 10,000 sacrifices. Here he sees hundreds of Passover lambs being offered. He sees generations of high priests entering the Holy Holies, trembling on the Day of Atonement. And here, towering over the wrecks of time, he sees his only begotten son dying for the world. See, even before Isaac was spared, Abraham had promised that God would provide a lamb. But on that day, God did not provide a lamb. He provided a ram. The promise of a lamb would go unfulfilled for almost 2 millennia. And then one day in a place called Bethany beyond the Jordan, John the Baptist would point his disciples to a man and say, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Abraham's promise of a lamb waited for a greater Isaac, one who will set all creation laughing for pure joy. It waited for him to carry the wood on which he would be sacrificed. And perhaps like Isaac, he looked up and saw the place rising in the distance. The Jews of his day called it Golgotha, the place of the skull. The Romans called it Calvary, but Abraham called it Moriah. We call it the entrance to paradise, the gate of heaven, the way to the Father. For it was here where Isaac was spared that the Lamb of God was slain for the salvation of the world. See, this is our God. This is your God. He sees these things, and he knows what he's doing. And the question is, will you and I honor him by trusting him with our lives?